Hey, welcome, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram. Welcome back, Josh.
Thank you. Thank you. My coup went well.
Good.
Thanks for thinking of me.
Well, last episode, what I mentioned that you were sitting on a high-profile jury case in Kenosha. So hopefully that got sorted out. But this
I
week,
think it's getting sorted out.
but this week we have with us Scott Clement, who is the polling director for Washington Post. He conducts national and local polls about politics, elections, and social issues. And we are so excited to have you on, Scott. Thank you so much for being here.
Glad to join you.
So, Scott, we have a lot to talk about with regards to polling. Now, Josh and I, before the episode, we took a poll amongst ourselves that we think is representative of our audience and found that 98% of our audience have no clue how polls work. So maybe you can kind of like start 30,000 foot view, kind of like what are polls, why do we do them, and then kind of whittle it down to maybe some of the mechanics of polls.
Sure. Well, I wouldn't count your audience out. I imagine many of your audience are smart consumers of politics like you all, and that you know your way around a poll here or there. But it can be a complicated world out there. So I'm happy to walk through some of the details or the basics or broad overview. I mean, so the public opinion polls have been around, from the beginning of the 20th century, even a little before, but they didn't start becoming sort of scientific tool until the 30s. And of course, the biggest purpose these days is to measure what people think on political, social issues, other things about the coronavirus have been very common. And there's the poll, the science of sampling and things that are a tool, which the main purpose is to draw conclusions about the population from a relatively small sample of people. But the other big part, that I spend most of my time on is thinking about how we can use polls to measure relevant political attitudes. That can range. Classic thing is, who would you support if the election were held today? Because that's a very important question. Is of course how people will vote. We want to know. We want to understand that. It can be a little bit of a fixation, but the other element is really the why. I mean, polls at their very best are a mirror of the country. They're trying to reflect back at us who we are, what we think, what our values are, and give us some indication of how we sort through all of the political information that's out there and make our decisions. And they're one of the most useful tools in doing that. They're not the only tool. There are many other valuable tools, but they're one of the only ones that is truly aiming to be representative, in that everybody has a chance to participate. Everyone maybe only has one chance to participate if you're selected. And it's trying to represent the country in all of its various dimensions, which are many. So that's one reason I particularly like polls and I'm passionate about them, is that they're trying to live up to the principle, of a little d democracy. Everybody has a say. So that's the main purpose of them. And then of course there's that's the ideal, and then the reality we can talk a lot about, and how polls do or do not live up to that idea.
So that I'm a fan of polls as well. They make you feel like super smart. They make you feel like, hey, look at how, when people like, they quote statistics and they quote like, well, 32% of people say they some of the times listen to Faithful Politics, and you're just like super pumped about that. So, but one of my questions though is like, how is it that you make sure that a poll is a quality poll? Like how is it that we can take a small sample and say and extrapolate from that and say, hey, this is how the country feels? Like, how do we do that?
Yeah, you're asking the question that statisticians were asking themselves in the 1930s and 40s, and they were just figuring this out. And, that's when
Hmm.
sampling theory was really developed. This idea that if you draw a perfect random sample of any population, whether it's people or businesses or something else like that, if you select one out of 100 of them, let's say, and there are maybe 10,000, if you get a sample of a certain size and it's random, then and you gather information about each of those people that you interview or businesses that you represent, that you can say something about that overall population that's within a certain margin of sampling error. So the classic, example, one reason why you see a lot of surveys about 1,000 people is that that's about the point where sampling error really starts to come down. So margin of error for a sample of about 100 people. Again, we're talking a little ideals here. Perfect sample of 100 people. No matter the size of the population, you have about a margin of error about 10 percentage points, maybe a little more. You go up to 1,000, again, perfectly random sample, and it's 3.1. So you can get a lot of precision going from 100 to 1,000 people. And that is true no matter whether the total population size is 10,000 or 20,000 or 20 million. It's remarkable. It's just the way that sampling theory happens to work. You can get more precise in really small populations. If there were 500 employees at your company, you interviewed 100 of them, the margin of error would be lower than for a company that's 25,000. But once you get beyond a certain level of population size, sampling error is your friend in a big way. In that just the level of random variation that you're going to see if you keep taking random draws from the population will be consistent. There are so that was one of the big revelations that revolutionized not only polling, but it revolutionized the way the Census Bureau collects data. It's a huge revolution toward what they call probability sampling. I'll just call it random sampling, but essentially it means that everybody in the population has some chance of being selected, and that chance is identical. There may be ways that you draw a more complex sample because you're trying to reach more of a particular type of group. Say you're interested in understanding the attitudes of people who are, I don't know, of a particular age group, or the CDC conducts a survey of young parents and people who asking about whether their children are immunized. That's a very small sample, right? So you have to do some different techniques to get that. But the basic principles are that you have this core of random sampling. So when you start on what makes a good sample, or what do you want to go, that's the classic route. Of course, actual polling these days, the Census Bureau can draw random samples because they have a universal population registry, right? That they do every year. Almost universal, I guess. Even the census, the count has some issues, but it's about as good as you can get. And they do their federal surveys off of that registry. So the registry of households. So that's about the best you can get. The long term, for many years, polls relied a lot on telephone surveys. That's still true to some extent. We still do a good amount of telephone surveys. Part of the reason is that almost everybody has a cell phone, so you have a chance at that ideal. But one of the big knocks on the ideal is that you can't actually interview everybody. Response rates have fallen a lot in the past few decades. It was pretty common in the 80s and 90s. You could get over 50% response rate, which is remarkable. That is unheard of these days, except for maybe a few federal surveys. So a lot of the development in the industry has been trying to overcome that with different techniques. Some of those relate to and are still being developed, but a lot of those relate to trying to better understand the people who do respond and the people who don't respond, and to ensure that your sample is representative on even more characteristics than you might have done before. So, sorry for going on that.
No,
That's really good.
All good stuff. Yeah. So, like, what are like the variables that can affect your data, or the stuff that may skew your data? And specifically, I'm thinking of two particular incidents. Like one, like the 2016 election. A lot of people say, well, everything said that Clinton was going to win, and she didn't. Or, here recently where we live in Virginia, it was sort of like neck and neck with McAuliffe and Youngkin. Youngkin took it, and I'm curious on like was are there factors that you guys have to think about, when you're talking to people or asking them questions, that will skew the results, or is it just sometimes like polling is wrong?
Well, I'm going to come to the defense of Virginia polling for the moment and say I thought the Virginia polls were pretty good. The final averages of Virginia polls were right around Youngkin +1. Our final poll was McCulloch +1. If you saw our charts, there, we called it a toss-up, and Youngkin won by less than 2 points. So one thing I'll make a point on that generally is that polls aren't precise enough to show a real leader in a race that's actually close, which this one was. This was a 2-point race. Polls can tell you that it's close, essentially, and we can tell you a lot more than that. We can tell you, how different types of groups are voting, what are motivating issues, things like that. But as far as the pinpoint precision, when you have a margin of error of plus or minus 3 or 4 points, you got to take that seriously, right? So that means there's only so much. The 2020 was an example, and 2016 a little to a lesser extent, of where you had what was called systematic bias. I mean, you had polls weren't just experiencing random error where some polls are missing in one direction and others are missing in another. There was an average error that underestimated Trump's support in both elections, and there was a lot of research right out of 2016 trying to understand that and trying to correct for that. One of the big factors that was identified was that many polls, at least at the state level, were not weighting their samples by educational attainment. So it's common for polls to weight their sample to try to match the population demographics, such as age, race and ethnicity, region, gender, and those were the really common ones used by pretty much universally. Education was used in many national polls like ours. It wasn't used in a lot of state polls for some reasons that are justifiable, some others that maybe just, it complicates things to weight by more dimensions. It can make your data a little noisier. And anyways, one thing that was clear was that polls tended to overestimate the share of voters who had college degrees. That's a really common bias in polls. It's been well known for many, many decades, really. And it's just that it didn't hurt polls for a long time because political views weren't as correlated, as connected with people's educational attainment, with formal education. That really accelerated under Donald Trump's campaign. He had a particular connection with white voters without college degrees, to some extent non-white voters without college degrees. And he had a particular negative reaction among voters with college degrees. So there was a polarization on that was larger than in past elections, which meant that when poll samples were overrepresenting some group within that, that they were more at risk of erring. I got to say, 2020, the issues are less clear. Even more than a year after the election, there was a big postmortem report by a major survey industry group called the American Association for Public Opinion Research. I'm part of that. And they looked under a lot of corners to try to see some patterns in where polls miss, why polls miss. And there were some geographic patterns, but it wasn't clear that there were a lot of differences in the methodology of surveys that were more or less accurate, which is a little concerning because it means that there aren't clear fixes. And I think the one other clue from that report is that polls just increasingly need to be paying attention and collecting information on the people who do and don't respond to their surveys. We need to get better at that. And there's a lot of work on that. There's a lot of federal survey work on that area. But it just is really important because, and we actually embrace more of this in our most recent Virginia polling, where we drew most of our sample from a list of registered voters that had been, each voter had been predicted to be either a Democrat or Republican or unsure, really, based on their past participation in partisan primaries. And what we did was we went out and we made all these phone calls to these voters, and we then matched everyone we could back to that database. It's a statewide database maintained. It's a private firm that maintains it, but the actual database is the state's list of registered voters. And the sample is weighted to match those values for partisanship on the file, which can help counteract any patterns in participation. I don't generally think Democrats or Republicans are much more likely to participate in polls as a rule, but there can be patterns. And there were signs of that in 2020 that Democrats were more enthusiastic about taking surveys in that election. And polls need to be prepared for that in the future and be prepared to observe that and actually measure that and then adjust for it as they need.
That makes a lot of sense. I hear you saying words like weighted average and margin of error. And I know like I can Google those things and look at Wikipedia or whatever, but I think it comes in. So my question is to help us understand what those are, kind of to demystify the jargon, so to speak. But deeper into that question is the issue of methodologies and what makes polls different. So I guess if you could help us understand like what kind of things you look at, like margin of error and weighting, like the methodology question, what's going on there when we're looking at polls, when we're trying to go behind the scenes.
Sure. So one of the first things I look at when I'm encountering a new survey that I've never seen before is I'm interested in any information on how they drew their sample. So there are two big buckets of surveys these days. Some that are conducted with random sampling, the kind that we were talking about before. These are like ours that we conducted in Virginia, where you have a population database or a list of every phone number, and you're calling it in a random sequence and trying to conduct interviews, and then that's one area. I think that's a big plus in a survey when it's conducted that way. It doesn't mean that it's going to be accurate per se, but it's got that root in random sampling. And the other part of it, the alternative is using a form of opt-in sampling, which is I don't want to say to drown you in more jargon, but really just these are usually conducted through online survey panels. If you've ever seen something advertised to you, say, hey, take some surveys online, do this. That's how those panels are built. They bring you in, they offer rewards to take surveys. Usually a lot of consumer products surveys are done in that manner. And they're very economical. They're very cheap to conduct, relatively, compared to traditional methods. So there's a real value in that, being able to do things in an affordable way. But because they're not using random sampling, they're a little more reliant on their weighting to help them out, whether it's weighting to political characteristics or to just a bigger list of demographics that can help represent the population. Those usually, if you see an online survey and it's not specifying how they recruited respondents, you're talking about an opt-in sample. Doesn't mean it's necessarily worth ignoring, but it's worth knowing that that's how they reach people in terms of calibrating your expectations for the survey. And then there's a whole bunch of things in between. There are many surveys done with a combination of both. The other things I look for are weighting. First off, do they describe how they weighted the sample? And weighting, it can be a very arcane topic, but think of it as just how did they try to make sure that the population, or that the sample ends up representing the population? Did they ensure the sample is representative with regard to the key characteristics that are associated with voting? Gender, age, race and ethnicity, region. If they tried to adjust by political characteristics, what were they assuming? Were they saying we're weighting our sample to match the partisanship of a previous election? That's informative. Do you think this election is going to be just like that election? Is that a good assumption? I mean, some of these things can take some time to evaluate. It's hard to sort of sit in an armchair and just say, all right, well, this I like this or not. And I don't want to encourage necessarily picking apart polls by looking at one thing or another, because the fact is there's going to be some part of any survey that looks maybe just unique. But at the same time, if if a sample doesn't look like the population, it ought to have a good reason for why. It ought to have a good reason for that. And if it looks very different from other surveys, sometimes these are called an outlier poll. First off, we don't know which is going to be accurate, right, until the election day anyway. So it's hard to really judge right from there. But the other is, I look at that in a positive light. If there are some polls that are published a little bit outside of the mainstream, that's a part of the overall data set. That's a part of an overall picture. And while those surveys may turn out to be inaccurate, maybe have to learn how, have some lessons learned, they can also broaden our perspective a little bit of the possibilities, because different polling firms use different methods, and that generally makes a richer place for understanding public opinion, to give us a sense of sort of what the possibilities are. I'll say that not to encourage, sort of like if there's a survey you see with a question wording that you find very biased, that's a different story. We're talking about basically just trying to provide a good estimate.
Yeah. Now with that, like I like you sort of separating kind of like, okay, we want to make sure that we've got representative data for the whatever geographic region or topic that we're talking about. But one of the things I think that I've always struggled with is like the categories, that there are. So like I'll put myself like as an example, like I'm an Asian African American, but I'm also like an evangelical. So like, I don't see polls that say, Asian African American evangelicals are more likely to vote for X, than, and I'm curious on like what do you say to those groups that are, that are part of sort of the melting pot of America that aren't represented in sort of like the categories?
Well, this is a really common challenge, an increasingly common challenge. I mean, there's been a lot of reporting about the Census Bureau and the census data from 2020, and how there's a growing number of people identifying with multiple different racial categories, or just sort of rejecting the boxing of what they want to be classified as. And the census is doing a lot of, work to try to fit people into some meaningful groups, but there's a tension underneath that, right? That is really that. That none of these categorizations always fit well. The first thing is I'd say is that small groups in the population are generally a big challenge for polls. So in a survey of 1,000 people, you think about, our threshold for reporting and results among a group is around 100 interviews. So if a group doesn't make up 10% of the population, we may have too few interviews with them to report confidently what they think. Now, there are answers to this. You can conduct much larger surveys, right? Which would be great. And I would be fully in favor of that. The other is to try to bring together multiple surveys to talk about, smaller groups in the population, or to conduct specialized surveys, and that's where we've often focused. As far as the small overlapping groups, or people that really just don't fit into a multiracial category or something like that, I mean, I think that's where the specialized survey really comes into play, where you really recognize that maybe this 1,000 interview survey is really good for a number of things, including tracking political attitudes over time. But it's going to fall short on being able for everybody to see themselves in the survey. Only really the larger groups, or groups that make up at least 10%, will see in the survey. The only caveat I'd say is that those respondents usually are in the survey, right? Now, maybe not exactly, but like certainly there are those groups in the survey, and those surveys are often weighted to ensure that individual racial or ethnic groups or age groups are represented there. We don't weight by evangelical status. We don't have a good benchmark for that. But I can tell you, we do have plenty of evangelicals, so we can report on those attitudes. In fact, today we had a story about Roe v. Wade where we we focused on white evangelical Protestants first, and we backed up the view to talk about all evangelicals. And the attitudes were a bit different. So I've been getting some good encouragement from my colleagues on the religion desk that we should do more work like that. I think that can help to understand things, even when we don't have enough to look at non-white evangelicals specifically in that poll. But some of the examples of specialty surveys are, well, we certainly don't do a lot of interviews with teenage respondents, but we did one this summer of teens ages 14 to 18, checking in with them. We did a similar survey back in 2005. In 2020, we did a pair of surveys just focused on Black Americans. There were side samples of all adults, but each was 1,000 interviews with Ipsos's Knowledge Panel, which is a nationally representative household panel. And the first one in January 2020 really set the stage for our coverage of the Democratic primary. And I thought was pretty prescient in showing the depth of, I guess, familiarity with Joe Biden that ultimately proved to help him win the nomination in South Carolina, though it wasn't a South Carolina poll. So, yeah, I think it's a challenge that polls just continually need to get better at. And part of the riddle is that some of the groups that are smallest and also most underrepresented in surveys are also the most difficult to draw quality samples of. So this is one where online interviews, like I talked about, the opt-in surveys where people join panels, they struggle to reach Latinos who speak Spanish. That's a really important segment of the Latino population. So if you're conducting surveys online, you might have to limit yourself to English only, or use particular lists or things like that to supplement that. It goes down the list for other things. There was a very interesting research panel last week, not a survey panel, but it was talking about these kind of challenges of surveying Asian Americans and how just there's a lot of work going in to improve that surveys among those groups. But the main thing that aligns them is that it's in order to do a really good job with it and do it well, do it the justice that it really deserves, it costs a lot of money, and it costs a lot more money than a normal survey. So I don't offer that as an excuse by any means to not do it. I just mean to be on the real side of, when it's not simply, I don't like the idea of just reporting a small sample of a group that we hardly reach in a survey and hoping that that's okay. I think we should only report results that we are confident in. And in order to do that, you got to invest in some higher quality methods.
Who do you think has the best? And maybe this is kind of a loaded question because you don't want to. Anyways, who has the best polling? I've heard it said that Fox does a pretty good job with their polling. But I'm curious if you had, any thoughts about that. I mean, like we'll just naturally assume Washington Post, ABC, whatever, has like the top rated. So like maybe the better question is who has the second best polling?
I don't have a ranking, though I think there are a number of places that do really professional work, and they. What I mean by that is that they're committed to investing in quality research and learning and improving it, which I think are the two critical elements that are going to serve polls well going forward. I mean, it's hard not to mention the Pew Research Center atop, among any group, because they have not only conducted an enormous number of high quality projects, but they've invested in the kind of hard to reach populations that was talking about. In fact, they did a real landmark survey on multiracial Americans a few years ago, which, doing that kind of work, so many people don't do it because it's too expensive, too complicated, too difficult. They really don't back down. And that is appreciated. Kaiser Family Foundation, biased because we partner with them on a number of things. Really ace polling team, big commitment to research and design. We work with them on some of our most complicated projects. We did a survey of healthcare workers earlier this year. We're on the frontline healthcare workers to get their experience as a vaccination and other things. And then, I don't know. I mean, I'll tick off a few others. I feel like the teams that conduct polls at Fox News are very good. They're professional. I think the company and the organization get a lot of, have a different, reputation or element about them. But the polling team I know personally, and they're professional. They're committed to doing things well and investing in their research. Same thing, Associated Press. I'm going to fail to mention everybody who I think is doing great work. But major national media organizations. I'm going to sound pretty biased on this, but they've long invested in high quality work. It's been sort of part and parcel. 1981 was when the Washington Post ABC News poll began. And, the Washington Post was one of the first subscribers to George Gallup's column back in the 30s. We've had, our interest in polling for a really, really long time. It's still very strong. I think a lot of the places and organizations that are passionate about this work need it to be high quality. They're investing in it, and but make your own judgments. Look at track records, do all that. And also, I think the only other caution I'd say is that keep in mind if there are ideological groups affiliated with surveys, political ideological groups. I don't want to be too cynical, because many of those groups do public opinion polls to measure reality and try to help guide their strategies and things like that. But that's also the territory where you see some polls that are conducted with the purpose of proving a point, with the purpose of showing that public opinion is something. And that's where we found this recently in a survey that was about support for repealing the Hyde Act or Hyde Amendment, which bars federal funds being spent on abortion services. Well, there was an advocacy poll that had been put out in a memo, and not much information was about the poll. Once our fact checker dug into it, found that there were a series of leading questions that were asked ahead of the important question in that poll, and that wasn't presented, and that's always disheartening, because I'd like to assume that everybody that's conducting this kind of work is really just trying to figure out what public opinion is, not shape it to mean it. I think most of the major pollsters are genuinely trying to do that. That there's, the incentives for being accurate and being fair are very high. So I certainly feel that. So and reputations are on the line on that. So I think there's plenty of good quality polls out there. Though, as I mentioned, good quality doesn't mean precise. Good quality doesn't mean always, pinpoint. So there's a sort of trust level, but also a, what's that big old grain of salt,
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And this is the last question, Scott. I've been super interested in what you've been saying. That if you had unlimited resources and unlimited money to conduct any poll that you would want to choose, what would be the question that you would want answered, or what would you want to, like, what are you interested in? What do you want to know?
Personal or professional?
Yeah, either way.
This is such a great question, and of course my answer is I can't decide. There's way too many. I think the areas where we don't do as much polling, but where I think there's a lot to be learned, is learning about people's personal connections, people's personal lives, and how those relate to various other attitudes. Some of is really inspired out of the kind of reporting that my colleagues do when they're telling interesting stories about or across the country, and finding people with just such a jumble of experiences and beliefs, and they don't always add up to their political attitudes in a predictable way, and I think that's interesting. I think that we see a lot of predictable. We know a lot of people's attitudes in politics are predictable, and that's fine. It's good to track that, but understanding the deviations from that, understanding the complexities, that's where I think larger surveys that dig into some of those relationships can be very interesting.
That's really
That's
cool.
awesome.
I would argue Facebook probably has a pretty good beat on all of that already, but I digress. Well, thanks, thank you, Scott, so much for spending some time with us. This was super, super informative, educational. I know I learned a lot, and yeah,
Absolutely.
and we just we thank you for just all the great work you're doing over there. So
Yeah, thank you,
appreciate it.
Scott.
Sure, appreciate having me on, and
Yeah.
hope to be in touch.
All right.